We're live. Hello, good morning. Thank you for your patience. We had a couple of little technical issues we had just to iron out to make sure that we were live and that you can hear me. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the first of two live events I've got today. This first one is called 4 Decades of Food Photography with 3 pictures. Sort of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, bit of an informal look at a personal take in how I've seen food photographs change and evolve over the years since I started. I'm really happy and really pleased that I have my daughter who's helping me on the tech team, which is so helpful that we actually managed to go live this morning. So we can switch, we have a second camera. And I think if we can switch to the big live camera, you can see maybe a bit more of an overview of the set as we get going. I think also we have a chat side to it as well, so you can post some messages, give us some thumbs up, or even if there are any technical issues, you just want to let us know you can't hear me, maybe just let us know if everything is not working as planned. So my name is William Ravel, thank you so much. And the important thing is that we are fundraising today for the Food Bank's Trussell Trust UK Food Bank's charity. There is a Just Giving link page, hopefully in the YouTube description, to my Just Giving page where you can make any donations if you feel that you want to donate to this. Thank you so much for those who have already donated. Or you can find the link on my teaching page, which is foodphotographytraining.com. That's all one word, foodphotographytraining.com. The second live event is this afternoon at 4:30, where I'll be looking at the 3 best and 3 worst ways of lighting for your food. Again, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, fun look at food photography. But my hope this morning is that you will learn quite a bit about how to use your camera in lighting, a little bit about styling as well, and just really get a good overview of how styles and techniques have changed and how you can apply those to your work. And if you're working at home or you're just starting up photographing your food. So I am photographing the same recipe 3 ways. Now the recipe I chose, I made up a orange drizzle cake. I cooked it up yesterday and I've been busy in the kitchen setting it up. Now, I am not the best food stylist by any means, and I've managed, and I'm so fortunate I've worked with some amazing, talented food stylists over the years. But it's interesting in that although my food styling skills are not great, I think by just photographing it in a slightly different way does help create some lovely pictures of your food if the food isn't the best, and I certainly fall into that camp as well. So I made up an orange drizzle cake and we're going to photograph it in 3 ways. Just to explain, I left college in the 1980s and managed to get a job in a food studio assisting in London, which was amazing. And therefore I was working in a studio right the way through the 80s and 90s, working with lots of really talented people, loads of talented photographers and stylists and food writers. And in the mid-90s, I set up on my own, and since then, again, I've been working as a food photographer. So as you can imagine, I've seen lots of different changes and different styles have come through over those decades. One thing I remember when I first started back in 1989, when I first started working, that the studio was quite dark, using big lights. It was almost like you were behind backstage in a theatre, or lots of dark curtains and lots of cables running along the floor. You had to be careful not to trip over. And some of the reasons behind that is that at the time, the type of work that the photographer would do and the style of work is they would set their camera at very small apertures. They would have the aperture at something like f/22 or even smaller, f/32. And if you remember, a large f number, f/22, f/32, means it's a very small hole or a very small aperture. And that gives you maximum depth of field. It gives you the greatest range of focus from the very front of your table right through to the back. And it was sort of like a badge of professionalism, or the way things were, that all magazines and cookbooks at the time liked to make sure that the food and the set and all the props were completely in focus. So if we were shooting at f/22, we were also working with film. And we were working with film with very low ISO numbers, 100 ISO or even less, 50 or 80 ISO, so not very sensitive film, which needed a lot of light. Those low ISO numbers gave you great quality images because there was hardly any grain in the film. So we were shooting in very small apertures, we were using very low sensitive film for that quality, so you needed a lot of light. You needed big flash units pumping out lots of light to just illuminate the set and to light it. So I'm going to set up my light. I'm going to put on my studio light just here. We're going to set the camera to f22 and then we'll talk a little bit about how the styling would work. So as you can imagine, the camera is set on the tripod. So I'll just get my light here and pop it up. And also I will close the curtains. The room I use in here has fantastic daylight. But for this demonstration, what I'm going to have is just going to have the light in place like this. And we're just going to switch it on and I'll just close the curtains. There we go. We're in. So let me just pull those curtains closed. It might get a little bit dark. Hopefully the cameras will pick it up, what's going on. There we go. Perfect. So yeah, so we've got the big light happening. We have the camera on a tripod. Now, a couple of things I've thought about in the styling, and this is being a little bit cheeky, is I think for me in the 1980s, it was all about big, bold colours. So I've chosen some strong fabric for the background, which we use quite a lot, a lovely sort of gingham check design, quite brash, quite strong. We have some complementary green, which is very 80s with the napkins. And we're using some really beautiful flowers, what we've got in shot. And also we've got the bowl of oranges to add an idea and a story. And this, for me, I felt that the 80s was very much about filling the frame with ingredients. So we would set it up using those strong thirds rule. I would have the whole cake in the foreground. We would have in the foreground the whole cake. But what you find with the frame is that each corner of the frame is occupied with something, whether it's the flowers, the oranges, or the napkins with the glass. I'm just going to take a quick picture. So we are at f22. The ISO I've set it at is around about 800 ISO. So the shutter is quite slow, just to make sure that we get a good picture. I'll just take a quick picture. And if we can throw up the picture on the screen, you should see the type of image that we are creating. It's the 1980s image one that we're seeing. There we go. And you can see the sort of picture we got there. I love it. It's really good. If you could just put it back up again, Rosie, I'll just talk it through. So you can see on the composition, it's showing the whole cake. It's right dead center, right up front, right in the camera. You've got those lovely flowers, those bright, bold flowers in one corner of the frame. Then you have the oranges on the other corner. You can see that there's something everywhere. And it's quite a strong image and it's quite beautifully lit with a big, strong light from the side. And the key thing is that everything is in focus. Thanks, Rosie. So that's how we sort of work for quite a long time, using those big studio lights, making sure everything's f22. And then around about the mid-90s, say, we began to see lots of beautiful and eye-catching and different pictures coming out of Australia. Australian photographers would be working with things like the Donna Hay magazine, Australian Food and Travel, and they were amazing. They were so different, and they were different for two reasons. First of all, they decided to start using wider apertures. So they would use apertures more like f2 or f4. So the smaller number means you have a wider aperture. That's quite key. A couple of benefits with that. As you open up the aperture, the depth of field becomes shallower, so things drop out of focus quicker. So there's a softer background. Gives it that sort of lovely, romantic, quite lush feel. That was one thing they did. The second thing they did, which seems a bit crazy, is they opened the curtains. They let the daylight in. So what I'm going to do is we're going to get rid of this light and we're going to open these curtains. I suppose in a way, in Sydney in Australia, where a lot of these photographers work, the light was amazing. So they decided to use the light as it was. So they would get rid of the studio lights And now a lot of the beautiful work that we saw coming through from Australia in the magazines was just using daylight. So I'll just pop that there. So we'll open the curtains, fully open, get as much light as possible coming in. And I found that at the time I was working in central London, and clients would come to me and ask me to recreate that beautiful Australian light in sort of dingy grey London. I have to say it was quite difficult. So we had to work around using the daylight in London to try and get those clean white pictures. One of the things we started doing was we would change the styling. How do we change the styling? Well, we'd get rid of our strong colours. So whatever colour background we were using, those 1980s feel would be got rid of. We'll just pop that down there. And we began to use these white surfaces. This is a white wood I use. It's absolutely amazing. But we'd use other types of woods or linens or just clean white images. Now I'm just going to move this because it's a really dark day today. I'm just going to move this closer to the window. Just give us maximum light as possible. There we go. So we would literally move the set closer to the window as possible to get as much light in. Also what I would do is one way round, which I talked about earlier. My cake wasn't the best. It was a bit big and it probably tastes nice, but it looked a bit weird. One way round is we began to use just single servings, quite small servings rather than the whole cake. We would then still use some interesting props, stylish flowers, but maybe just a little bit more subtle, a little bit simpler in the styling. So you see we've gone from a picture that's filled with props, filled with colour, and now it's sort of all about the food. This does mean that I need to go in a bit closer, drop the camera down. Now one of the good things about opening up the aperture, having a big wide aperture, is lots of light coming into the camera. So you can, which I used to do quite a lot, is photograph handheld. Take the camera off the tripod. Now that's a great idea because it gives you lots of options for coming in really close and being really creative with this sort of image you're photographing. But you need to make sure that you don't get camera shake. I'm a bit obsessed with camera shake and I talk about it a lot on my other courses. Camera shake means when the shutter speed is so slow that you get that camera shake, feel that sort of natural body shake. And especially if you're working hard, or you've had two more coffees that you should have, you're going to get a lot of camera shake. So you need to set the aperture wide to get that shallow depth of field, and you need to have a decent fast shutter speed. Now, it depends on the type of camera and the type of work you do, but for me, I try and make sure that I've got a shutter speed of about 160th, that's 160, 160th of a second, to make sure that there is no camera shake. But it doesn't really matter. If you find that you want to really have a bright picture and it's a dark day, then put it back on the tripod and use those slower shutter speeds. So we're using the natural daylight. We would also probably bring in a little bit more light by using card. Bear with me. I'll just get my white card coming in. So I'd create some card, pop some card back in on the side to reflect that light coming back in on the cake. So let's see. So I'm going to set it at f2.8, the widest this lens will go. I will take this up to 160th of a second and I'll just go in nice and close and I'll focus in on this portion of cake and we'll take a picture. And if Rosie, if you could show the picture for the 1990s version. So here we have the 1990s, much simpler, a much brighter picture. And the shallow depth of field really works well. I think this is a great image. And also what I like about it, maybe because it certainly reminds me of my time in the 1990s, is that you can pick out the nice bits about a piece of food. So with the 80s, it was all about the big cake, and all in focus. So quite often you might find that parts and elements of the food you don't really want to show up. Here you can really concentrate on just getting a beautiful image of just a portion or a small area of the food, which is a really nice way around it. You can see the highlights on the fork and the daylight coming through, and that's a classic example of the 1990s. Thanks, Rosie. So again, that worked really well for a long time. And I think we, certainly in my work, a lot of that sort of white on white sort of feel worked really well for many years. And then there were two strong changes, two differences. I'll pop that down for a second. Two dates. 2007. What happened in 2007? The first iPhone was distributed throughout the UK and Europe. 2007. So when that started happening, we found that there was a general feel, I did notice it, that quite a few clients and people I work with, and certainly my own work, we began photographing things a little bit overhead. It didn't quite pace up too much, it didn't get particularly sort of snowball too much until 2010 when Instagram started. And those two events since about the late 2000s, 2000, and I'm sure you're aware, we have been photographing things quite a bit overhead, and I see it a lot. Many food pictures are photographed directly overhead, showing that sort of look of quite graphic feel. So it's slightly, not slightly changed, it really changed, it radically changed what we are doing. And I feel that one of the reasons is with those smartphones, the lenses on a smartphone are wide angle. So the shots that I've done so far for the 1980s and the 1990s, I was using quite long focal lengths, standard 50mm or longer, 70mm. So that long focal length sort of foreshortened the foreground and the background and made things quite sort of painterly. With a wide angle lens, if I was to come in these angles, it would really distort the whole picture and just wouldn't work so well. So overhead is where we're going to go to next. I'm going to make a couple of changes. So we're going to get rid of our beautiful orchids. I'm just going to put this to one side for the moment. And I found that how it works really well is a perfect example of a more current picture of today is we're going to darken up the background. We're going to make it really rich and dark. I'm still going to use the natural daylight. So we've got these beautiful dark woods, as you can see. And then we're going to go back to a more busier, much fuller, bit messier type image, as you can imagine. So now what we're going to be bringing in is other elements. And this actually is quite fun. We've gone from that simple one plate, one flower type arrangement, very similar props. Now we're going to go really messy. Hang on with me a second. So I'm going to bring in some of these slices of the orange that make up the story. We're just going to get rid of these big oranges here. Pop those down there. And I found that what's really lovely if you work with these overhead images is that you can really enjoy the process of creating a really interesting food story. It's busier, it's messier, but it's great fun. I love it. And also, I'm just going to bring in these extra fabrics again, which I think work really well. So we're just going to put a wave of this lovely fabric coming through. We're going to get our slice, but I'm not going to keep it on the plate. I'm going to turn it on the side, and we're just going to pop it on the set like that. And we're going to just create a really lovely story. Pop that in there. Now what I'm looking for is lots of crumbs, lots of texture, building up a story. And the last element I'm going to use, which I did use when I baked this cake, was our lovely baking powder with some brush coming in through like that. And then one last element for the filling. There we go. So we've got, if you can see it, we've got the cake overhead. We've got the slice turned to the side because we're going to be overhead. We have the pan of the sugar syrup. We have all the elements coming through. I'm just going to bring that round there. Last thing I need is to get my camera and go overhead. So I'll put that pot down there so I don't tread on that. Now there are two ways you can do this. If we keep the shutter speed fast at 160th of a second, you can hand hold it and you can just simply step up and take the picture. Or you will need to put it on a tripod. Now I found that with the tripod, if you're not really confident and really used to using a tripod, it can waste a lot of time trying to set up the tripod and getting it ready, and suddenly the food's just died or gone cold. So I would encourage you, where you feel happy to, is just to keep hand holding your camera until you're confident enough to start using your tripod. Because going overhead, you need a tripod which is quite strong, sturdy, and give you a lot of height for versatility, and they're quite expensive. So certainly to get going and start working with food, use handheld. So don't forget, if you're hand holding it, you want to make sure your shutter speed is 160th of a second, and you want to be able to choose your aperture accordingly. Now, with the 1990s, with that out of focus, shallow depth of field effect, we were using very big apertures. Overhead, it's a bit more that things need to be more in focus. We want to make sure that the top of the pot is in focus, the top of the cake is in focus, and also the background and the surface. So we're using smaller apertures, which is larger f numbers. So we're slightly going back to using those f16s, f11 apertures. So you have probably, if hand holding in, you're going to have to increase your ISO. So bear that in mind as you work with your food, that you want to make sure that you've got a fast shutter speed to not get camera shake, and you want a decent ISO to give you a nice bright picture. So a couple of things I add to this, which I think work really well, is I add some black card. This adds a bit of shadow and shading to the picture, a bit of vignetting. So I use these black cards, and if you can see, I just put them around the set to just give some shading and shadowing all the way through. There you go. So what that'll do is it will darken around the edges, making sure the cake and the elements are still strong in the picture. So let's take the picture. So making sure my steps are sturdy, I will go up, pop it around there, and I'll come through. Hopefully I'm not going out of frame too much, and I'm up here, and I'll just frame up. And what I'm doing this time is I will take the picture and I'll get Rosie to put it up. There we go. Great, thank you. If you could pop up the last picture. So this is our third and last picture of today. 2000s. What can I say? It looks amazing. It feels really good how you can really create a composition that's slightly off center, that's quite relaxed. We don't have the food in the middle. We have the elements around the outside. It feels like a sort of snap and go type picture. It feels quite modern, but it also sort of has quite a few throwbacks of nostalgia. It has quite a few elements of the rusticness about a picture, but it feels quite fresh, and you could use that whether you're using a smartphone or a big camera. So there we go. Interesting journey, I think, don't you think? I think that since the 1980s, we've gone from those pictures being in focus, sharply in focus, and yeah, do feel free, Rosie, just to put the pictures as I'm talking through them. So everything's in focus, you're using those big, bold colors, big studio lights with big cameras on tripods, and then we move into the 90s, where it becomes freeing up a little bit. It's all about more aspirational and more lifestyle, where you're using much simpler compositions and probably quite small items of food. And then lastly, the picture where we're overhead, where it's all lovely and sort of rustic and full of texture and tone. The same recipe over 3 pictures showing those 4 decades of change. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for taking the time joining me this morning. And again, if you can donate any money towards the Trussell Trust Food Bank Charity UK, that'd be so helpful. Thank you very much. And I am back again, 4:30 p.m. this afternoon, where we'll be looking at the 3 worst ways and the 3 best